Okay, and we're recording.
What's
Mr.
going on?
Dylan Foley, how are you?
Hello, how's it going?
Good. This is outside the colony podcast. It's a bit outside the realm of the colonial empire that has lasted for centuries and still continues to this day. But we're based here in Sligo, the northwest of Ireland, on the western front of the ocean. So we have a kind of a resistance. With that, we're just going to talk shite mostly, but we're going to pick up on bits and pieces that might be interesting if people are interested. The theme of this talk will be MMT, which is modern money theory, if I'm correct. Now, that's a shitload of a mouthload of jargon that goes in there and terminology that will fry your brain. But we're going to break it down, so I'll be interrupting every 2 seconds for Mr. Foley to break it down for my viewers, of course, not me. With that, give us a brief introduction who you are, what you do, Mr. Foley. I think you have a range of interests. You're not just what's that, one horse show or one
One
stable pony or something.
one trick horse.
That's it. All right, tell us what's the crack.
Dylan Foley. I usually wear the archaeology hat, don't I, when I'm doing these things? But it's but yeah, there's a range. One thing about archaeology is it covers everything. So it's like it's not that you know everything about everything, but you have to know a little bit about a lot of things.
What's archaeology?
Study of ancient things.
Study of ancient things.
They say the ancient things, but really it's about study of where things come from. Actually, is probably a better way of putting it. Like where does everything come from is probably the way to put it, isn't it? You're looking for the origins. You're looking for the origins.
Yeah, origins. Well.
Anything and everything could be where the cups come from. You know, it could be spoons. It could be as mundane as that, or it could be the systems of government or social systems or nation states, or it could be very highfalutin. It could be philosophies and technology, or it could be literally, like I said, spoons or cups, or could be food. You know, anything basically. Yeah. That's the way I look at it. That's the way I look at it anyway. I have a broad remit on it because in field archaeology, you might come across anything and everything. So you don't know what you can't. You kind of can't choose. I know it sounds weird, but it's because of when in field archaeology, you can't choose what to study. What the stuff is just there in the field, and you don't know what you're going to run into, so you have to deal with it. If you know what I mean.
So when you see these excavation type things at road works or in fields, that's your people.
Yeah.
They're just checking out to be sure they don't destroy something that they found accidentally or something.
Well, that's it. Yeah, that's a mixture. That's a mixture now. I don't know how much you want to get into that. The good side of it would be telling people not to destroy things, and the dark side of that would be that archaeology does destroy things, but it does it under license.
Janet Crystal would like to talk.
Sorry.
You want to tell Janet Crystal you might want to call her back.
Yeah. Everything going off this morning.
Sorry?
Everything going off this morning.
Yeah, tell me about it. I'm trying to bring all my bits and pieces of equipment that I picked up over the years in, what do we call it, the recycling centre, and put them together, my computer and monitor and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, brilliant. Well done. Right. So good. Very good. I've just come from... Sorry?
I'm communicating through recyclization.
Yeah, well, that's brilliant. That's the right way to do it, isn't it? Talking about ancient objects.
A ceasefire between Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
That's good news, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, that's good news. Indeed, yeah. As you said, they must have been listening to you the other day.
Yeah, I was actually on Ocean FM this morning. And one of those things that popped into my head, because I know you for quite a while. So I'm familiar with kind of frameworks of, I wouldn't say archaeology so much, but history. And also that we come from a community that's embedded about upholding history, the great clans and the names and all the shite that can cause, I can tell you. But nevertheless, it is there and it's part of kind of my past and what you do. So it was a kind of a good click, a good match in bringing them two kind of stories together. You get an opportunity to see into traveler culture, mentality, and from in there, you seem to be searching and finding all sorts that relate to the physical world of history. In other words, what we know to be true, and so on and so forth. But on the Israel-Palestine thing, I was thinking the origins, because in my mind, there's a kind of even if you want to go back to Rome, there's that mixture of the trio. It's like a three-headed demon. It's got religion, it's got politics, and it's got corporation or companies or business, whichever one people want to call that. And three of them kind of blended. I mean, you had the politics in the empire, then came religion. That became a threat. So they almost hijacked religion and incorporated it into Christendom. So now you had the religion and the politics. Along comes the privateers. That lasted for so long, it broke down. England most of only found Machiavelli, because that's the only one they seem to run with ever since. So of course now, and they also wanted to break away from the Pope because they wanted their own economy and all this kind of stuff. Now they loved it for quite a spell because religion was having people very obedient and that suited the royals, no hassle. But they wanted to come a time when they wanted to break the finances. England were getting sick of the Pope and the Vatican taking in all of these monies from various countries. So that caused conflict. But basically, anyway, they speed it up. They would be the three elements I would see in it. They believe, the politics, and the company. And that's what I was kind of thinking with the Jewish community. Not only the Jewish community, but throughout the century, they would have been persecuted long before Hitler, centuries before Hitler, right up to that point. And again, it was about yellow garments, yellow hats, and identifiers. All of this might sound a bit of what the fuck has this got to do with anything? But in tune of mentality, history, origins, where something once had began, you can see the effects of it still playing out today. So part of me believes that, and no excusing the behavior, that the Israels, more than Irish settled and probably other nations or communities, are traumatized, that they've been so long oppressed that they become the oppressors out of complete fear or thinking this is a normal practice. Because when you compare what Israel has done with the rest of what the Western world has done and still doing, I mean, there's a thin line between hypocrisy on both sides. I'll throw that over to you.
What do you mean? Yeah, okay. What do you mean on both sides?
Well, when you have the Western kind of not taking responsibility of their own history, you don't see America taking responsibility.
Oh yeah, you're not including. You don't mean you're not including the Palestinians there, obviously.
No, I'm not. I'm talking about the Israel side. But the Palestinians are the victims of this. There's no getting away from that. Yeah. But in a way, to understand it, you know, I think, as you said, it's like a subconscious thing.
No, normally when you say both sides, people think it's Palestine, Israel. You mean the Western world and Israel. You know what I mean? You mean they're all on the one side, in a sense. You mean the allies like America and Israel.
Well, yeah. Well, there you have it. Then. I mean, they are one of the same in most regards. And I suppose the English did colonize them. The Americans took over from England.
Yeah, well, like you said, it's a very that's a long and complicated history, but it's not. It's if you could look at it in many different ways. Yeah, I mean, you're looking at it there from imperial, or it's same as Ireland. Let's roughly it's not the same story as Ireland, but it's the same empire that gives rise to the modern problem in Israel and Palestine. They actually would have. There was a quote from an English politician at one stage, I think, during that division. Creating an Ulster in the Middle East, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So there was that idea of divide, of creating that division and putting one crowd in charge was something that the empire was very good at. However, it was all a bit of a mess, wasn't it? Because it kind of got created after World War II and the persecution, and so I'm not going to.
My reading on it, even on the history, the old stuff on what the government have up themselves. I mean, it was a highly thought out strategy on behalf of America. who had kind of stayed out of that war for the best part of a year, maybe or so. When England were under extreme pressure, they literally have written it down. They literally stripped England of all its colonies. And at the same time they were doing that, Central Motors was selling weapons to the Germans and anyone else who would buy them in Europe. This came from Noam Chomsky for part of the research. But
Yeah,
my
but
point
see,
is,
yeah, but you have to remember
my
that.
point would be is that England, see, stretch Gaza, right, out into Ireland. There is no comparison at the moment. But you couldn't say that entirely about Ireland stretched over time. From genocides.
No, you couldn't. No. I was going to say. Well, I would say that. Well, firstly, selling weapons to people. People often come up with that thing. But again, you have to watch out for hindsight, in the sense that, you know, oh, these guys were selling weapons to the Germans. Well, that's not that unusual. They were all interlinked, just like they are now before World War II. You know what I mean? And at the end of the day, another point would be that people forget that Nazis came to power legitimately in Germany. Whether you agree with it or not, they came to power legally, if you know what I mean, and therefore they were recognized by other states as the legal government of Germany up until wartime, essentially. You know what I mean, or even during war. Sorry. So it's only afterward, with the atrocities and people looking back on what happened, that we're all shocked and horrified. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But up until that point, everyone was doing business with them, of course. You know.
Well, look at it. It's the exact same thing we see today. And
it brings you up questions. It does bring up questions, like you're saying, of legitimate. It's that concept, isn't it, in the law? Who's legitimate? What's a legitimate government, and who's a legitimate state, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and the other thing you can find globally is the Anglo-Irish, Anglo-Asian, Anglo-Chinese, Anglo-Danish. This Anglo program is literally everywhere.
So that's interesting. So what the Middle East when the empire had taken it, had been under Ottoman Turkey up until World War One, and the English ended up in control of those areas after World War One, as far as I can remember. Like, this recent history is not a thing I'm a huge expert on, but the point would be that there wasn't nation states as such weren't a thing in the Middle East. You have to remember. They called it, they drew lines on a map called the Sykes-Picot lines, dividing one country from another, creating these countries kind of not randomly, but semi-randomly, like Syria, Iraq border, that kind of thing. You'll actually notice that one of the major things that ISIS did when it got control of, which is a telling thing, it got control of areas of Syria. It filmed itself using bulldozers to eliminate the border, the old Sykes-Picot line that was drawn by the British, if you know what I mean. So yeah, you could say that, like, the idea would be that they're trying to create nation states out of places that the mentality wasn't to have nation states. There was the Arab world and the Islamic world, and it had been under various empires: the Arab, the Persian, the Arab, various types of Arab empires based on Baghdad and that, and then the Turks, the Turkish sultans and things like this, and Egypt. But it's not something, in my mind, that would have been. It's not a nation. It's not nation states as such, if you know what I mean. The idea of a state entity is quite different. So the modern nation states are created in the Middle East in a kind of colonial. You know, it's a part of a colonial project.
Ireland wouldn't have been a nation state either one time ago.
No. Well, nation state it depends how you define it. Some nation, okay, there's the state, the kind of Western style state is one thing. Not all not that many states are nation states in the sense that they have one nation in them. You have different types of ones. Very few of the European ones were actually nation states anyway. Most of them started out as kind of like more like empires, really. You know, France and Britain and them. Yeah, you'd have seen that with the other historian, you know, looking, you know, what's his name, the American historian, who would be very much into that kind of, say, like Brexit. They're looking back to a time when when England was a nation state. Okay, it's a nationalistic movement back to the time of the nation state of England. But unfortunately for them, as what's his name is? I've forgotten his name now. The Yale professor, Timothy. Timothy Snyder would point out, there was never a time when there was any England nation state. It never existed. And therefore they're nostalgically looking back to something that never really existed. And of course that causes all kinds of problems. But as we know, the stories that people believe about themselves are the thing that drives the politics or the actions of the day. So, so going back to the Israel, it would believe that's the point. At that time, after they were promised, there was always those Jews had been scattered around the world in the 2nd century AD by the Romans. So it goes back to the Romans. The answer is always the Romans.
Yeah.
When it comes to European stuff, they'd scattered them to the four winds, different ends of the empire. Spain, Italy, all across Europe, and they hadn't had a nation state in Israel since that time. But they were promised then the Zionist Jews had decided that with all the persecutions that had happened throughout the centuries, that the only way that they could be free of them would be to have their own nation state, if you know what I mean. And where are they going to have that? Well, there was various versions around the world. And then the idea was, well, obvious place would be in the homeland, that in the Bible says that for the more extreme Zionists, that the Bible said that God had given them this land and all that kind of stuff way back in the Bronze Age, practically, so in the Bible and all that. So so after what had given that a real impetus though is the persecutions in World War II, and then the Jewish people landed in. And I think the point we're trying to make here is that they start creating a nation state in an area that didn't have one before that is the important thing. I actually don't think it matters so much for what we're talking about, that it's who does it.
Yeah,
it's that it's a Western-backed. What it turns into, as you point out, is a Western-backed nation state. Well, let's just say state with a kind of empire project on it, if you know what I mean, like a kind of idea of a settler. What do they call it? Settler colonialism is really what they would call it. Yeah, and it's something that we would be familiar with in Ireland.
That's why I think I see all these links with things. Would it be Native Americans, African Americans, other countries that has a link, a connection with the same system that almost decimated the whole entire Ireland. So, yeah.
Well, these are a particular model of state, particular model of Western state based on money and on banks and on a centralized monetary system. Which is where we're going full circle here, because it goes into.
Absolutely. But come here, just before we get in there, another thing. People aren't familiar with this. It's apparently professional hackers have hacked into the National Health System computer and robbed, borrowed, copied, transferred all of the personal information, and then contacted the HSC, demands 20 million. But our brazen company, I was going to call it, government, does not negotiate with terrorists, even if they're hackers, and have said they did not pay. Double, apparently, the hackers have sent the HSE the codes to receive all of the information they had stolen. What do you make of that, Mr. Foley?
Yeah, it's a bit confusing. They're saying that they got surprised because the decryption code was sent. Which is a bit weird. We don't know whether they paid or not. They're saying they didn't pay, but we don't know for sure, to be honest. I mean, how can you know?
Well, this is it.
It's a bit mysterious, but it is true that it's a double type of hack. It's not. They didn't just encrypt the data on the servers and leave it there. They also stole it. So apparently the hackers have copy of all the data, if you know what I mean. So therefore, maybe they give them the code, maybe they give them the decryption key, and they have the data to sell anyway,
And had that something to do with cutting the funds to HSC Security net? I've seen some I won't say well-known, but some authoritative type character speaking out and giving out about the system because it was underfunded or had fundings cut.
It was, yeah, I'd say a lot of health services have those kind of problems, but Ireland apparently spent about a quarter of the average IT for its IT departments in the health service, but less
How
than
much did they spend?
less than a quarter of the average spend, like say compared to other countries. It would have funded its IT by less than a quarter, and then also when it came to cybersecurity in the army and that, we were supposed to have this response unit and all that, but they also took all the money off them. I don't think they even have any computers.
That's
apparently they gave it was in the newspaper. They gave a.
Where does Ireland get its security system? I mean, is it an international company, or have they got their own in-house?
Well, the HSC is running Windows, and I'm not sure what other contractors they have for security. I mean, the security be a kind of all right, but I mean, ish. But it's not that. It's just the system, as you say, underfunded. So it's all a lot of it's running old software, and a lot of the computers had run out of. Were supposed to be updated and hadn't been, and Microsoft would stop protecting those systems.
I think we'll learn more from this in the coming weeks, whether or not the government paid or not. But now let me jump from there into another situation with the same government, oddly enough. There was a big controversy there a while back. Actually, there was something funny that happened there lately in between this side story, but part of it. The government forgot to vote, and Sinn Féin's motion went through to reduce houses in Dublin to a fixed price and so on and so forth. I don't know if that'll be corrected or not. But the same government, if I can get my head around this a small bit, and this is leading into the MMT thing.
Oh, yeah,
because I used to think about taxes and all this kind of stuff. And we're often got criticized. Farmers don't pay taxes. But when you find out what the taxes are for, we say, why would we pay them? So we're not benefiting from them. We're getting prosecuted, if anything. And then you were telling me more about that. But before we go there, the Irish government had, I don't know where to start. Basically, it's a state job to provide for its citizens and to look after its citizens the best it can. So the elected government. The government is to build or invest into social housing. They get the money from a bank, and the bank then hires the development agency, a private company. Is that right?
What's going on at the moment?
Who hires who? Is it the bank that does the hiring, or does the government?
The government apparently can't build any. No, yeah, the government's saying it can't build any houses directly because the banks won't fund any builder that's smaller than a certain scale. They're not interested in it because we only have 2 or 3 banks left. Remember, two or three commercial banks. We have AIB, Bank of Ireland. I think there might be one more. Don't know if TSB still exists, but Ulster Bank are gone basically, and there's hardly any banks left. And the only banks we have are commercial banks. So they're for-profit banks that running for the profit of their shareholders, not for anyone in Ireland as such. You know what I mean?
They're all for big fish.
Although the government does own, I think, 14% of Bank of Ireland. That's about it. But other than that, yeah. But
so basically, anyway, the state.
Oh, sorry. Anyway, yeah, they won't loan the money. So what they're saying is they need big finance companies to come in, like the big funds, to put up the money to build the houses, right? So they're letting them come in. They're like foreign pension funds or big funds that are real estate funds. They're just companies that are have a lot of the capital or money floating in from the finance markets or rental sectors and from government bonds and things like this that are the investors' money, basically rich people's money, essentially in a way, mostly, and they just want to invest in high return stuff, if you know what I mean. So they're not interested in social housing. Will be the first point, and that's what you're talking about. They're getting them to put the money up to build the properties. So they're building the kind of properties that they think they'll get the most money back on when they rent them. And as you said, those same companies are also buying them up off the plans before they're even built, so that they're the landlord essentially, the big landlord investment firms, the big right ones they call them, isn't it? REIT.
Okay. Where does the government?
Weird thing, as you said, the weird thing about it is the government is investing public money into those private companies.
How does that work? I mean, yeah,
the private companies are building houses, but then the private companies are buying the houses, driving the prices up, and then buying the houses before any individual can actually buy them. And because the government's putting money into those things as well, there's no possible way that an individual could compete against that kind of thing. You're essentially competing against the government on house prices. And the government is winning the race because it's got endless amounts of money. So it's putting all the money in, right? So the house prices are really high. The government, private companies that the government is funding are buying up all the houses. And then you, if you buy one, have to, you're only allowed basically to rent one. You have to go and rent. And when you rent, you have to, whatever work you're doing, doesn't matter. You have to pay all that money to this private company that's not even based in Ireland, but that your government gave money to invest in houses. It's like
that's fucking nuts.
So basically a lot of people can't afford any, like there's a huge shortage of houses, firstly, and secondly, nobody can afford what is there. Hardly anyone on any normal wage can afford it.
What's the point of the government investing 200 million of the public money into a project like that? Oh, well, where's the gains in that?
Well, I think they think that they're like a business and that they'll somehow get rents back, or you know what I mean. Well, we can see there's a sort of fundamental misunderstanding going on there, I would argue, if you know what I mean, in the sense that I think the government thinks that okay, so I've heard them speak on the radio, and my understanding is the government thinks that it cannot get the government thinks this is the right thing to do to get these big businesses in from outside the country. Okay, so this is going to sound ludicrous when we get into it, because they think they can't find any money to build houses because the Bank of Ireland, AIB, won't fund builders to build the houses up front without a buyer being guaranteed at the other end, right? So if you're a builder in Sligo or Athlone or Cork, whatever, it doesn't matter, and you want to build 40 houses or something, and then the bank says, well, no, because you don't have a buyer lined up, you know what I mean, and they just won't give you the money.
Let me jump in there for 1 second. Something popped into my buildings by developers. Do you remember that?
Sorry, lost you there for a minute.
Okay, I see here. Yeah, in there a while back around the housing market, the Celtic Tiger time. Remember the time, a lot of spending and development, buildings going on left, right, and centre. And then a lot of them were derelict, a lot of them were faulty, flawed, and a lot of them were abandoned. Has that something to do with the banks not trusting the government to handle such affairs?
No, it's no. Okay, so we're going like to go backward. If we want to go a bit further behind that, it's not the banks. Okay, so we only have a couple of commercial banks. That's a problem. Let's imagine that, like, that's what I'm saying. So I was just saying that a builder would go to the bank and then they refuse him, right? But if you're a really vast company that can afford to put the money up, big finance companies can afford to put the money up front to build the apartments, but they're also buying them up at the end, if you know what I mean, in order to own them and get the rents off them for X amount of years, if you know what I mean. However, there's a problem because they're only investing in things that are high end or things that have high returns. So they'll invest in Dublin City, but they're not investing in social housing, and they're not investing in anything that's going to be sold at cost or helps out poorer people or is any form of social housing at all, really.
That's good. So the other way of looking at this is the state.
So it's a banking issue there, right? You can see there's a straight banking issue, first of all, okay? Ireland, a lot of the banks in Ireland have disappeared. I think KBC ran out the door there recently, and Ulster Bank is withdrawn, and this is all in the last few years. So there's no choices left for people to go to get finance for their businesses or for houses. So they're issuing mortgages, all right. But if you think about it, they're issuing mortgages to people to buy the houses that are already bought up and owned by companies that are hand in hand with the banks in the first place.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's 6 of one, half dozen the other. They own them. They own you on both sides. It's just a joke in that sense. You know what I mean? You're just getting a mortgage. You're just getting money to pay money to rental companies, and the money is just flowing back into the finance sector, if you know what I mean. Which is then taking that money, taking those rents, and investing it into more property and then trapping and then issuing more mortgages to people to pay more money into the investment sector. You see the cycle?
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. So it's just a cycle of the same money going around. Now, where it gets really interesting is when you start getting into like where the money is coming from and whose money it really is, if you know what I mean.
But just before we go there, right, there's another similarity to that, I think, and what I mentioned before to you, is that practice, that system, seems to be very little in the difference between multinational companies that come to Ireland that don't really pay tax, stock people into them, they pay taxes, but the products and the taxes made in the company go elsewhere. So that's a bit like coming in, getting free labor in many ways, and also subsidies from the state. How does the state provide subsidies for companies, but not for social housing? Does the state not have a money tree or a machine or something?
Yeah, well, it does. So in so that's what we're talking about. MMT, as we were saying, would be is modern monetary theory, which is not modern at all, as someone pointed out to me when they were arguing one day. So that's not. I'll tell you one thing they said. That's not modern at all. That's ancient. But they were saying it to me as if that was a bad thing. But it's not a bad.
Good video. You sent me a good video of a guy called Michael Hudson.
Yeah.
And I listened to a bit of him, and he was speaking actually going back as far as the Bible and biblical times of this modern so-called system or theory.
Yeah.
And he was saying, which I found very interesting, that back then the word sin meant debt. So pay for your sins means pay for your debt.
Yeah.
And a bit maybe like when people say Jesus died for your sins.
Yeah.
He maybe died because he was trying to alleviate from a tax break or something.
Yeah, of course, because if you think about it, it was under the Roman Empire. So here we go around in a big circle again, because it was the Roman Empire was extracting resources from its empire, and at that time that was Palestine or Israel or Judea. I think the Roman province of Judea it would have been at the time. But and yeah, of course, there was lots of revolutionary movements, and Jesus was a part of that. If you're looking at it historically now, not religiously, Jesus was a part of that. Or in and amongst all of those there was a lot of revolutionary movements, a lot of national, religious or otherwise movements, a lot of which were to deny exactly that. What do you call it? Deny the Roman tax collectors, which are famous in the Bible. There's that. I mean, there's a famous bit, isn't there, where Jesus goes into the temple and the money changers are all there. Yeah, and he throws all the tables over because this is from their point of view is an abomination to the religion and to the Jewish people, that the money changers are in the grounds of the temple, if you know what I mean. But the economy of Rome was very much based on, obviously it was an empire based on the extraction of resources, and one of the ways they did that was by taxing the people in its conquered territories, and that's what they did. So what were we saying? Yeah, Rome. Where were we? MMT. Yeah, modern monetary theory, which isn't modern at all, like you're saying, except what it is a description of the monetary system as it's developed in the modern now. It's a description of how the money system works now. Okay, which is descended from very ancient times, which we can go into sometime as well if you want. But
why do people pay taxes?
Okay, so what's the popular thing for why we pay taxes?
Travelers don't pay taxes. That's popular enough.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, this is where we go around the circle with empire again. So why do we pay taxes? Yeah, exactly. I mean, we could ask those questions because a lot of people we're under the assumption that we pay taxes to fund the government to allow it to do things, isn't that it? So we're throwing the money into a pot. Yeah. And we're assuming that if we didn't throw that money into that pot, that the government wouldn't have any money. Okay. And a lot of politicians would give you that impression that, oh, sure, we don't have money for this or we don't have money for that. Where would we get the money from? They say, okay, because we'd have to tax people, you see, But if you think about it, where does money really come from? Is the question, money as we know it. Where does it really come from? It doesn't actually people can make all kinds of things. People can grow potatoes and carrots. They can make, I don't know, spoons. They can make metal objects. They can, light lampshades, whatever. But there's one thing that me or you or nobody can make, and that's money. Like, you literally can't manufacture it. And in fact, if you try making money, you'll find out how quick you might get shut down.
Who makes money then if we can't make it?
You try running your own money machine, see how far you get. Yeah.
Oh, the people are still trying it from time to time.
Yeah, I know. Used to call it coining in the Middle Ages, and people were always getting arrested for it when it was easier to fake the coins. But anyway, okay, so we don't make money. Money is created in NFT. Would start with the principle that money is created in the modern age is essentially a creation of government. It's a creation of the state, if you know what I mean, and it does so through the central bank. And the central bank is the government has a very big checking account in the central bank, and it gives a license to the central bank to create debt in the central bank. Create a credit note to credit that. Basically, to allow the central bank, to allow other banks to have an account in the central bank, if you know what I mean. And the central bank literally just puts numbers on a computer saying, if you want to issue €1 billion, you just write -1 billion on an account in the central bank, and that 1 billion is credited then to to the other banks, if you know what I mean. They have accounts with the central bank, essentially. Okay, is actually probably how it works, really. But it's no more nor less than creating figures on a computer these days, because it's not connected to gold. It was until 1970. Some people might say, oh, well, sure, look, there must be a gold held or whatever, but that's not true. You could have a currency attached to gold, as in you have to have as much gold as what you're saying there is money, if you know what I mean. And that used to be this old way of doing it. But since 1970, it's now what they call completely fiat currency. So fiat, I think the very first words of the Bible, actually, to go around in a circle, fiat lux. No, it's not the first words, but there is the words in the Bible that say in Latin, fiat lux. It means let there be light. So fiat in Latin is let there be, and it means that it's created out of nothing, essentially.
That's
so
amazing.
You literally just write. It's like, right, you could write it down on a piece of paper.
Okay, if you were to go anywhere pretty much in the world, well, almost anywhere, and tell people that money isn't real, there's a good chance you might end up with a black eye, if not laughed at.
Well, it's real. It's real in the sense that it has real consequences, and it's a real thing. We created it as a technology, so it's a fantastic technology, if you know what I mean. It allows us to do stuff that we couldn't otherwise do, I think when we look at the history of it, we can understand why it's so clever, and it's a brilliant invention. But I think it's important to understand where it comes from and how it's created, because otherwise we're in this problem of what we just said. We think we pay taxes. If we look at it that way around, then we understand that money comes from the government. Therefore, when you pay a tax, what are you doing? You have to get money from the government in the first place to be able to pay the tax. So actually what you're doing is giving your money, when you pay tax, you're giving your money back to the government that created it in the first place. And so if you look at it, what does the government really do when it takes taxes in? Is it actually is cancelling the debt that it created in the central bank? Okay.
All right. So hypothetically, say the Irish government borrowed €1 million. That's a massive sum. Just say hypothetically, they borrowed 1 million, and then they squandered most of that. Now they have to pay back the bank 1.1 million, say, interest. So they go into the room and say, look, let's jack up the tax for that. Let's create a tax for that. Let's create another tax on top of that. Does it work like that?
Yeah. Well, no, hang on. So you're getting into a central point in MNT, which is that what it means is that if it's your own currency and you're already issuing the currency, right? You can't ever run out of money, and you can't not ever pay it back. You can always pay back the debt. It doesn't cost you anything, if you think about it, because you're the one issuing the money. So you can't ever run out of money, and you can't ever not be able to pay your debts as long as they're in the currency you're issuing. It's different if it's someone else's currency, okay? So we can get into that.
What you call it? America has that system, haven't they?
Yeah. Well, we all run a system like that. So we're running a system like that, except we're using euro. So it makes it a little more complicated because we're dealing with the European Central Bank as our main bank that's creating the money. Okay, but so let me just put it simply, like, so you said we borrowed $1 million. So what do you, when you say borrow, what do you mean borrow? You mean borrow from where? Like, where would we borrow $1 million from?
Yeah, so the state borrows from the central bank, isn't it?
Okay, so the state doesn't even, yeah, okay, so you could say that it borrows, but it doesn't even borrow. In a sense, it kind of, yeah, you can say the word borrow, okay, but it's not really a borrow. What happens is the central bank just creates the money in the account by creating a minus, a debit account. It's like they call it double entry bookkeeping or whatever. So there's a debit, whatever is put on the government, say the government has a giant account to pay for nurses and hospitals, for example, right? And IT security, okay? So it needs to spend 20 million to pay gangsters or whatever, right? It has an account in the Bank of Ireland or whatever, say. It would, all it does is the central bank credits 20 million into that account in the Bank of Ireland. And minus 20 million is written into the central bank's ledger. And you see that minus 20 million that's written in there? That's the beginning of what we call the national debt. Okay, so as that mounts up, that's the national debt. But what the national debt really is, if you think about it, is it's whatever. If it says minus 20 million in the central bank, that means there's 20 million out there in the economy. It's put 20 million out, so it's a national debt, but we don't owe it to anybody, because if all the tax was to come back in, if every penny we put out came back in to the central bank, the account would be back to zero. You see?
Kind of. Yeah, it's mind-boggling because
it's
not just on that.
It's so simple. It's so simple. It's confusing.
Well, this is it. It's kind of like when I talk about mentalities and the colonial system and imperial system, not the system, but the mentalities. For me, I can understand it pretty well, but to explain to somebody else, it's like grating their brain and their neurons.
Yeah.
And then part of it, that's just fucking stupid.
I know.
To be that simple. It's kind
of.
No,
it couldn't be exactly. A lot of people look at it. I think that a lot of people have trouble with this because it can't be that easy. It can't be that simple. Like, they can't be just like that. But that's the point.
Right? If they could do that, why don't they print the money to take people off the streets? Provide services with good outcomes, create enterprise, indigenous businesses, do all of that kind of stuff, and build a good, strong economy.
Yes.
Instead, they've got imported software, imported professionals running the companies. They've got imported everything.
Well, they're
to Ireland.
Well, if we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this, it's the problem of, like, what they're saying, that they don't have the money to build houses. So now you start thinking, hang on a second, what do you mean you don't have the money to build houses? Because it's not that. It's that they're using the money to invest in private companies and getting them to build houses instead of them building houses directly. But the money, and this is the point, again, this is another point. The money that all those private companies have and that the banks are issuing to the people for mortgages, and every penny that the big financial investors have, that's all coming from our money as well. That's not they can't create money either, if you see what I mean. They can't create.
Isn't money, I'm only thinking out loud, but isn't it almost like worse than heroin? Isn't it an awful addiction where you create, say, because when I go think about the colonial system, because you're thinking about this, I'm still thinking of the big imperial system where it fits into in many ways. Now, if you think about that system, right, part of its invasion and conquest, one was to break down a nation, break down a people, chop up its land, landscape, all of that. It was to smash up a society, out of that create communities, smash up the communities, and out of that create individuals. And out of them individuals, it would put them in debt and tell them to go out and exploit other people, open companies, and do the same thing they're doing.
Okay, well, the first, yeah, you're right, because the very first origins of it, say, and we go way, way back, long before Rome, into Sumeria or Babylon, okay? And the very early times, it's in modern Iraq, again, to mention Iraq, but where human civilizations kind of began. So we call them civilizations because they're like the beginnings of cities and empires, and they're systems that are based on, to some extent, based on money. On the origins of, you know, the writing and money and centralized systems. And it's actually in those kind of systems that that money as we're talking about it is invented in order to, it goes hand in hand with the creation of armies and empires. So in the early days, you would have an army where you were like kind of just defending your area, and you could only supply an army out to about 5 miles away or something.
Come here, just on that. Do you think not you think, but maybe I'm thinking that maybe money wasn't necessarily intended as a widespread thing, but a fixed thing on armies, empires, soldiers, that kind of setup first?
Yeah, when most people had no business with it. Most of the world never dealt with money at all, and even in the Middle Ages and that, they never really had any money. You didn't need money to do exchanges, and they didn't use barter either. They just people gave each other stuff essentially, but held an account of it, and settled the account at the end of the year or twice a year or whatever. Or sometimes they would have a measure. They would have a gold. Often there was such a thing as money in the sense of gold, but it would be literally a measure, as in a kind of way of universally translating. You wouldn't actually be handing bits of gold to each other. You'd just be saying that these 3 cows are worth this much gold. And it would be like a way of rating them, if you know what I mean. And then it would be a way of saying, well, those 3 cows then are worth the same as 52 pots or whatever, because I can
tell you, the Middle Ages, I can think back at very young, and even travelers that didn't have bank accounts, didn't have them kind of services or access. Money, if we got it and accumulated and working, would either go into horses, it would go into something of an object with value that could hold its value and carry its value, whether it be jewelry and stuff like that. So that would be their kind of transfer of wealth.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the money is given its money is value. It's an object usually that doesn't have any value in itself. It was created by, the only way that it has value is that you have to pay tax in it. Okay, so for the people involved in the state system or in the empire system, the way that, okay, so to go back to Babylon, and we say that the army, right? The point would be that kings, at first, they used to hire, obviously people would just defend their little area, fine. But then it became, there was wars between states, okay? So you'd have to go and invade the next state. But you'd have a problem on 2 fronts. You might hire soldiers to win the war, but you don't really want to pay them you don't want them walking around with, credit notes against you. You know what I mean? You don't want to be owing them stuff, essentially, right? So they would actually give them gold, whatever, because obviously soldiers could just take it off you, or they might just take over your state, or take your grain stores or whatever. So to keep them in order, you would give them gold that they could carry around with them. And then what you do is you declare, in order to get the army supplied by the people of your country, you then say that the people in the country have to, it's a very simple thing that developed. If everybody once a year has to hand in a piece of gold to the central temple to the king, okay? That means that everybody in the country has to get a piece of gold. And then what you do is you only give the gold to the soldiers, okay? So they're the only place you can get that gold. So it's gold with a little head stamped on it or whatever. And so wherever the army goes, the soldiers have gold. And wherever the army goes, the people will bring chickens and cows and milk and metal weapons and anything they can to get the gold off the soldiers, okay? And and they'll trade. So there'll be wherever the army goes, there's a market, okay? And wherever there's a market, there's exchange with money, if you know what I mean. And then when those exchanges happen, the people have the money to go and pay the tax. To the government at the center. But the reason the government imposes the tax onto the people is to actually control where resources go to. Because if they didn't do that, then the resources would go in all directions, but not necessarily to the army, if you know what I mean. So you impose a tax. So money, one thing that gives money its value in the modern age is tax itself. That's one of the functions of it. It's not to pay for anything. It's to make sure that it has a value, though, because everyone needs to get a hold of it to pay to the government. So you can see then as well, though, just like in the army example, if we give the gold to the soldiers, then all the people will have to go to the soldiers and give them stuff to get the gold to pay the tax, right? But if we were to give it to someone else in this society, then all resources would flow there. Do you know what I mean? So in the modern time, wherever the government puts money is where resources will go to, if you know what I'm saying.
It's a good way, I suppose, to build up little kind of beginnings of towns and villages. You know, if the armies can't such a place, most people will sort of make their way there.
Yeah, that happened later on, and in Roman times, and that where literally to this day, I mean, a lot of the big cities in the world, London included, are actually Roman army camps, because the city of London, actually, interestingly, which is the huge financial center, actually is the Roman army camp.
Yeah, that's right.
Around which that developed. So like that's really quite interesting in the sense that, well, you're totally right. So where an army is stationed means it's getting paid centrally by central government. It's getting gold coins, and wherever it's stationed, then a little town will spring up because a market will be beside it.
And wherever there's an army, there's always a chance of war.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's a war machine.
Yeah, so it created like that, but then it would allow bigger and bigger empires developed over time until eventually end up with the Roman one, and you can see then that it's this enormous system where wherever you go, this is how empire works, as they copped on eventually. You march in, conquer the place, whatever you want to call it, win a battle, and then you just make a declaration. Everybody here has to pay these many of these coins to the central treasury at this time.
Where did you get the coins?
Job done. Job done. Yeah. You know?
But you know what you say to them, you have to pay coins and you're in debt now, you got to pay taxes.
Yeah.
And the people saying, well, we don't have any money. What's money?
Yeah.
What happens there?
Well, that's it. So the only place you can get the money is you have to go to their town or their army camp, or you have to go and get a job.
Yeah. They say to them, look at it, you got cows and chickens and stuff there. Bring some of that over there where the army is at. They'll give you the money. You come back, pay us our tax, and there's a good chance you might live.
That's it. Yeah.
That's a great system, isn't it?
That's it. That's the beginnings of it all, and that's kind of what we're talking about. That's like, so that's what we're talking about. That's the beginning of it all, yeah. And so there is
a couple of parts in there. Sorry to put the question in terms of, sometimes people can have a conversation and you go with the flow with it, and they got a good grasp on it, and then somebody comes along and says 3 sentences, and your face goes red because they just collapsed everything that you taught or whatever it might be. Because I like the simplistic version in terms of, if money has no true value other than what a state or a bank puts on it, how come the state can't print money to deal with social issues more so than creating debts in banks and our taxes?
Well, they can. I mean, that's the point, is that that's what MMT would be. That's one of the reasons it's worth studying, in the sense that we're trying to, what we'd be trying to say, that the reason it's important to understand that history or that thing about money, because then you can see clearly that there is no reason why they can't do that. And that it's a political choice. It's nothing to do with money. It's purely a political choice, where they say, oh, we don't have money for this, or we do have money for that. So they have lots of money. So you can actually see it. Like if anyone had any doubt, you can actually see it during the pandemic, where they've where loads of people are out of work, loads of people not paying taxes, and quite the opposite. There's about 1.5 million people all on pandemic payments, right? None of them paying tax, no taxes going into the coffer. But at any stage, do you think the government was actually going to run out of money? If you know what I mean. They didn't say, oh, we need more taxes because we need to pay everybody. It's quite the opposite to that. It actually is, they're able to just credit everybody's accounts any way they want at any moment. And in our case, this had to be cleared at Euro level because it's ECB level, if you know what I mean. But the ECB said the same thing. The ECB said, make sure you keep your system operational, whatever, you know what I mean. So you people are out of work, fine, you just pay them whatever minimum and all the rest of it. But you can actually see that the state is capable of paying any amount of any money to anybody it wants at any time, and it doesn't have to rely on taxes to do that. Taxes have nothing to do with that. The taxes have other. Sorry, go on.
A few years ago, I think it was, when we were trying to learn bits and pieces about even racism, but it was in South Africa. And South Africa had apartheid systems, whites only, blacks only, the same shite, almost like what we have in Ireland. But something had happened in the 60s where I think was some part of Asia, were highly technological people and were a great asset in any country. So they were sending their students and their companies to South Africa. But the problem was South Africa had laws on apartheid. So what they did was they classed the Asians as white people. Now, the Asian people know they're not white people, and they probably wouldn't want to be white people. But South Africa was willing to classify them as white people because they needed the economy, they needed the money. So it is very political. So I was just thinking on the sadder side of that, where you do have a government and state, and we've seen, even in recent times, even kind of minor, I wouldn't say minor, but compared to what's going on in the world, you'll see people lose their homes. They couldn't keep up the mortgages, lost their houses, lost their farms, lost everything. People lose their jobs, pandemics, all of this stuff happening. People are homeless, people are underfunded, health services, cancer services, and all it is digits. Somebody can just put a few digits into the keyboard and sort out a lot of these problems.
Yeah, well, it's not that, well, they mightn't sort them out perfect, because what the real world still matters, obviously, like where resources are and how skilled you are. So how much money you put into the economy is kind of like how effective it is relies on what people do with it, essentially. You know what I mean? So
I think the bigger problem there is, correct me, I'm sorry for the biggest problem there, I think, with this, and will be with the monetary system theory in America, is that what might good come from it, the digits that might go with goodwill, will be swamped up by middle classes, left, right, and center.
Yeah. So there's an element,
a soakage.
You're right, and this is why it's very, very important that people understand it, whether they be in the left, middle, or in marginalized groups or travelers. Doesn't matter who you are. I think that I think everybody needs to understand that, because otherwise, exactly what you're saying happens. They'll happily work off the principle of MMT, but they'll happily send that money into for example, what we just talked about at the beginning. That money is all public money. At some point, it's either coming from another country or coming from ours. A lot of it's coming from ours, as we've discovered. Okay, so they're using public money is created to allow us to control where resources go and distribute them across the country. Okay, and how they're distributed to everybody. And you can see from what we're talking about that all of that money is now being taken from one. They're controlling the flow of the money directly into the finance companies and speculation on housing, and funneling it all into property and rentals. None of it's going into manufacturing base around the country. Very little of it into infrastructure. Very little of it into public goods like that, if you know what I mean. Things that make everybody's life easier, like public housing, infrastructure, better railways, the hospitals, and all that kind of stuff. But actually, they could just as easily invest in all of that. And create the jobs there. They don't need, when they're saying to you that they need private companies to do that, that's not true, because the private companies, no more than me or you, cannot create money.
Yeah.
They just can't do it. They're relying on the government as much as me and you are. Now, what you said is a problem already, because ECB, for the pandemic and that, said keep the system going, and actually said you can borrow from the central bank, like you've described, any amount of billions, there's 1 point something trillion or whatever it is. It doesn't matter how much it is. Basically, there's enough freedom there to take as much. We can make as much money as we like to keep our system going. But you're correct. That money has been diverted, instead of being spent across the country like it was supposed to be to keep everyone's little jobs going and all the rest of it. Most it's been diverted it's been caught in Dublin and diverted into a giant housing bubble.
Yeah.
So it's too much money in the one place is the problem there. It's all being caught up in the banks. The banks are, because they've allowed the decision on spending to go just to those commercial banks. So the commercial banks are saying, as we said at the very beginning, when someone goes to them with a business idea, you go or I go, or that man who wants to build the 40 houses, they're saying no, they're not interested because the kind of millions they can make off of other big scale stuff. They're not interested in the small guy. And they're very big international banks. And then you start to see that what's missing in Ireland is all the other banks have left. Well, all the other banks have left. And what, say, for example, compared to Germany, where Germany has the same capabilities. Germany has a sector, though, where instead of like 80% or 90% of it being commercial banks, it's the other way around. I think 10 or 15% of it is commercial banks, and 80 or 90% is community banks, they call them, which are a little bit like credit unions, except they are banks. They are able to create money, like we talked about. They have an account with the central bank. And if you go into them and ask and say about a business, they're not for profit, right? They don't they're not there to make a profit. So there'd be one in each area of Germany or each city, if you know what I mean. They run their economy on this. You go into them, they issue you the loan for your business. They're not trying to make a profit. So they're a much wider remit. And if you want to build 20 houses, they'll give you the money to do so. If you want to build a business, they'll do so. They have no remit to make ever greater shares for their, ever greater profits. And therefore,
but they're not in it for the profit so much. The ordinary Joe and Jane has a very good chance of.
No, so they're using, in those cases, those banks are community banks, are have a license to issue money. That's actually creating money. Okay, so they issue you a loan for your business of 100,000. Obviously, that 100,000 comes from somewhere. It comes from the central bank that we described, checking account. It's government money, but it's being put into something at a community level to build a better economy, if you know what I mean.
I gotcha.
So that's you can see that's missing in Ireland. There is no banking system that's there for the people, because the bank, and that's supposed to be issuing government money, which is our money. All of it's our money. But it's not possible to use it at the moment because it's all hijacked by commercial banks and finance and rental sector that actually don't create anything and are actually just using it to trap people using property that people have to live in because they've no choice but to live in something. So if they can own everything, they just extract rent out of you by having to do nothing. But essentially, that's all public money that's supposed to be used for the good of the public.
But isn't that almost the principles of colonization, even until it's beaten conquest, where they were taking land, chopping it up, creating walls, little houses, and then putting the people that used to live there back in there, and then charge them rents and taxes and so on.
Yeah, well, of course, the British Empire is based on the same thing. Yeah, so it was based on the same thing, and actually was based on private companies coming in, opening mines, taking resources. The government itself would issue taxes. Sorry, would demand.
What if money was real and it really does go to places? And I'm putting this together now, right? Because something popped up there a while back. Do you remember? I think it was Fox News. A couple of the channels were showing footage of UFOs, unidentified flying objects. And then I had often seen the global debt is trillions and trillions and trillions.
Yes.
There's a connection there.
Yeah, there will be, because you're right.
Who else did he vote to?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a global debt, exactly, and that's the whole question, isn't it? Like, who did we borrow it off?
Yeah, where
Martians or aliens of some sort. Yeah, because there's nobody. That's the whole point. There's no. Yeah, that's it. Because
maybe I'm sure we will, because like I said, it's not just one thing we've been interested in. It's quite a broad range of things, including UFOs, believe it or not.
Yeah, and not paying taxes.
That's a very stereotypical thing. Anyway,
I don't pay them either.
No, I don't mind either. I mean, what are we getting for? We need slaughter, psychological torture for what? One thing worries me is that because. And again, the real global scale from Israel to Palestine to Rome, right here to home, is for me that if the majority of the people in Ireland can't recognize travelers, don't know who travelers are, don't know who travelers came from, don't know very little about their history other than what they get from the Anglicized version, hadn't changed in 1922, hadn't changed much in 1963 because they were doing the same things that had been done to them. Today, these people are operating the government, giving 200 million to private companies and have no idea about anything. That's going to be something to convince people, isn't it? Even on the monetary system, where you're trying to convince people, it's going to take quite a bit of art or something to project that.
Yeah, so yeah, it is quite difficult. It's difficult because I've seen them discussing it. There's a guy, there's a Bill Mitchell professor of economics in Australia who would, and he's had to get into things you're interested in actually, which is I think cognitive psychology, or it's the old thing of like how people perceive reality. Like is it a 6 or is it a 9? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it actually is one of them tricks, because for a lot of people, what we're talking about is either, it seems so simple when you understand that, oh yeah, it's a 9 or a 6, but it does depend on which way you're looking at it. So like the ideas about what we're talking about money are actually very simple. So simple that a lot of people just dismiss it as that can't possibly be true, and if that's true, it also is a bit frightening, because if that's true, that means, oh my God, it's really obvious how we've been conned.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And what's actually happening here. And then, maybe the people outside the system aren't as daft as they look. You know what I mean? Like, to put it in those terms, because there are people who go, oh, them there, and they don't pay tax or whatever, But it's like, we can see from this that it's not.
Nobody really.
Not looking at it the right way around, huh?
Yeah. Nobody really pays taxes other than those who are put into servitude of kind of being held
People
under law, held in debt.
So tax, people do pay tax, but it's not paying for services. It's not paying in the way that we expect it. Tax doesn't.
That's what I mean. It's a debt put on the person more so than a debt the person owes.
Yeah, so it's a debt put onto the system in order to, allow money to have some value and all the rest of it. And then obviously it also has this other thing where what you do with taxes is actually interesting in MMT. There is a reason to have them, but it's actually, for example, to remember we were saying that wherever you put the money, the resources go there. Okay, yeah. So money is kind of like power; it controls resources, if you know what I mean. So like, yeah, exactly. So wherever the money is, that's where the resources go to. So everything's flowing to Dublin right now. Exactly. So that also tells you that if somewhere is getting too powerful, or it's holding up resources, or controlling too many resources. So, for example, housing crisis, right? This is that means that's where you use tax. You tax them to release resources, not to get money to pay for stuff. But you tax very rich corporations or entities like that in the finance sector, for example, or very rich people who are investing in that on purpose, because that will free up resources. If you take the money off them, they'll start having to sell the houses, okay? And it'll open up the economy. It'll open up that part of the economy that at the moment is trapped in.
The flip side there of it, and again, it goes into mentalities as well. That, say, on one side, the average lay people are paying these taxes, working for taxes, shouting at people who don't pay taxes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And that's the world they live in. They believe that's very real. And it's a continuation, and it's a system. And you'll hear me on about the English language, how it's a very trade systematic language. So it's actually perfect language for the tax system, because it's a very believable one. The one behind that, right? Now, when you're living in this world, you're individually tied automatically to debts. Now, once you're put into a house or a village or anywhere, you're automatically paying somebody else for staying there against your will even. So you're automatically in debt. And with that, they'll put other taxes upon you to make sure you're embedded. Behind that, the people who are printing the machines, or the people that have the machines printing the money, pay no taxes because there's nobody to pay the taxes to, and are free to buy up and swamp up just about everything and anything you can in the perfect nature and principles of the continuation of colonization. And that is dominance and power.
Yes.
That's what we're dealing with.
Yes, yeah. that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. Yeah. But we would go one step further then and say that we also, if we understand it, that we can probably make it work better for everybody, because it's not a system. It's not something that's like it's a sophisticated enough system that we could actually use the money in ways that would mean that everybody would be housed, that everyone would have medical care, and that it wouldn't be such a big issue. Because we live in a time where, here's the irony, as I used to be joking about, and it's a bitter joke, but I would joke that like we could house everyone in the Stone Age in Ireland, in the Neolithic, but we can't. But somehow we can't do it now.
Oddly enough, we had a bigger population a couple of centuries back, haven't we? We'd almost twice the population we have now.
Yeah, we did have a bigger population, yeah, and exactly. But most of us weren't involved.
Back then, during them systems, right, it wasn't about money or taxes so much, because it would be an awful shame on the clans that if there were people living rough in their tuas or their territories, so everybody had a place. And not a place to stay, but a place within a society, that there was no laws that he couldn't go onto the land and stay there if he had nowhere else to go. There was no wills or things against him. So when I talk about the mentalities, about seeing it one way and the other way, you'll see when we push it back a bit further, even for Sligo, the west of Ireland.
Yeah, no, you're right. So
you will see that mentality for all of what it is.
Yeah, so exactly. So it's a really interesting thing in the sense that like it's all connected, in the sense that Ireland was not in Rome. Ireland is then taken into that system much later. So instead of talking about like the British Empire and always in the terrible, we could also say that it's an invasion of that type of monetary system, if you know what I mean, a centralized one based on Dublin, that is trying to impose a tax across the country. It wants to put everyone into debt across the country and use that to control the flow of resources in the country. So it's all about power and control, and we know that. So yeah, you're right, but that was resisted in Ireland for a long time. And Ireland, traditionally, because it hadn't been in Rome and all that, it didn't have that type of economy. We ran a system that was very different, based on distributed system, not centralized power, and not based on money issued by a central power.
Economy and systems like that are all concepts and ideas of the mind.
Yes.
So if you didn't have that to begin with,
it was never going to exist. Sorry, it was never going to exist. Yeah, and you're right. Yeah, it's a mentality thing, and then it would explain why, even up as far as the famine, like you're saying, like a lot of the Irish population in the Irish-speaking mentality, in the Gaelic mentality, and travelers amongst them, or as part of that same system, it would have been indistinguishable, more or less. We're not involved in that monetary system. Now, we had to pay our rent of a turnip and a pig and all that kind of stuff, but in general, it was still issuing goods rents, if you know what I mean. We in general were not part of a monetary system. Failed to more or less failed to bite in Ireland, if you know what I mean. It hadn't developed even by 1850, and so it was quite rare. The towns hadn't really developed in any major way. There was a few largish towns, like Sligo was one of them a little bit, but so what you're saying is very important. Yeah, the mentality in Ireland strongly was still not involved in the state money empire system, was not something that had developed in Ireland, and still hadn't in the 19th century. And in fact, it still hasn't in some parts.
When you think about it, a few centuries ago, it was you that showed me that it was documented, recorded how the Irish felt about the English mentality and their systems, and they just couldn't understand why they would want to own the land and the water and the trees.
So there's an awareness of it, isn't there?
That wasn't that long ago. Now let me add to that, right? Let me add to that. In 1963, under the new now found identity crisis, Dublin, it wasn't English or Irish anymore. It didn't know what it was. Anyhow, in 1963, they carried out this report. Actually, sorry, it was prior to that, 1960s, leading up to the 1963 report. But within there, they had carried out various analyses and studies. They found travellers in good mental health. Can't say the same today. We've one of the worst health crises in the world. Also in there, they were saying that they were quite taken back and surprised that these people, although not formally educated like us, more or less, were very intelligent people. Actually, we find many of them that do very good business on the road and while they're traveling. They were like nomadic business people. Some of them had up to recent year vehicles. So this idea, again, going back to the colonial empire, backward Irish, stupid Irish, and then when it was the Protestant turn to say about the Catholics, and then it was Dublin's turn to say it about the west of Ireland and travellers, all of it is interconnected in that mentality is because even up to that point, our economy was different to the colonial one. These were a fixed, permanent spot where the army is. Ours is far more mobile in nature because we could take a shit along the road and not have to live in it. Something to that effect.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a whole history there, and it's not quite. I mean, it's written in certain respects, but it's not. It's kind of backwards. But you're right in in the big picture, it would explain a major part of how Ireland was brought into the British Empire was all about money and the issuing of, like, for example, stopped. They would have basically locked off the country by sea in about in the late 1580s, 90s, and they
surrounded it or locked it off.
Basically, yeah, lock off trade, so we're not able to trade direct with Spanish ships and French ships and all that. Then block us from using what at that time was the international currency of gold, for example. Stop us using that, and then very importantly, on purpose, government policy, the English government policy, issue copper coins, which were not accepted by anybody except them. Okay, so you could have a handful of copper coins, which are basically worthless.
Oh my God, that's a slave coin.
Yeah,
like you're literally belonging to me because you can't go anywhere else with this.
You have to go to our shop. You have to go to our town. Yeah. And so that's what it was. So they would take away that, and that's and then issue the order that we just said. You must pay your taxes in these coins. Right? And then you
pay for your sins.
Yes. So you now owe us. You owe us because we're letting you wander around the place, but you have to pay us. We've let you live. You have to pay this stuff to us, and you have to pay using those stupid coins we just made, right? Everyone knows are worthless, but we want them back, right? But the great thing about them from the English perspective was the Spanish would laugh at them. You know what I mean? You couldn't give them to a foreign trader you couldn't buy guns, you couldn't buy gunpowder, you couldn't buy armor, you couldn't buy any of the weapons trades that we had traditionally been buying.
Almost like a dictator without a country and having a name on the currency.
It's just worthless. Well, you can see how it's controlling money. You can see how that would control the system. So then people had very little choice then but to go to where the local, like we described in the ancient days, they would go to where the local little English fort was, and then they would just build a little shack, and that was it. Like you'd end up living there, or you'd end up. You can see the towns in Ireland. A lot of them developed even later, and they're just along a road where the English came along and built a road, and then they'd just go down to the road and put a blanket down, sell some turnips, and the next thing you'd have a row of houses. So you have those linear villages, like they're just a row. It's just a line of houses along the road because literally the Irish just came from the countryside and sat along the road, and to get coins off passersby. Huh?
That's pretty amazing. Come here, say if people wanted to find out more about this or find out maybe where you're at, you're probably the only one, well, maybe one of the very few experts at the moment on this in Ireland. So do you have a Facebook page or something?
Well, there's MMT Ireland on Facebook, and there's just new the MMT Ireland on Twitter, which is brand new. I don't have any followers yet. I'm looking for followers.
Yeah, because it won't matter to me and you anyway, because this is not something that me and you are hung up about. Well, it's interesting, but it's also part of what we're talking about from Rome to home. There's abundant stuff in there. Projects, history, archaeology, arts, music, talk shows, game shows.
Exactly. It's part of understanding how things are the way they are, if you know what I mean. And it's one powerful way of looking at it. I mean, we have other things, the colonialism, the history, the this, that, whatever. There's many ways of looking at it, but I think understanding the monetary system is very important. It's important for Irish history. It's actually important in travelers' perspective, because we can understand things about like how people inside or outside the system, why they would be outside it, and it shows how, you know, people, as you said about mentalities, why would you be involved in that? Like for people who have there's no benefit from that, and it wasn't actually designed to benefit you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was designed quite the opposite. It was designed to break in Irish history. It was designed to break that society up and create a new one in a different way.
Smashing up societies and communities and individuals.
Well, that's what the colonialism. Yeah, so the colonialism is, as you say, it's using the same instruments that can be used for good, but to use them to create to break up a certain society and to recreate it in a way that suits the person who's conquering it.
All right, just another thing, because it could be one of those, it could be one of those things where we accidentally picked up something as they're talking about it, and there's good reason for it. I've noticed that I don't see any politicians, left wing, centre, right wing, really getting into this, talking about this, other than saying we bailed out the banks, our tax, the working classes, the taxpayers. If they're saying that, that probably means they don't know much about MMT, or is that the case?
Yeah, the banks bankrupted themselves essentially by gambling everybody's money. Yeah, and no, you're right. That would show. Yeah, that's not looking at it from that perspective. That's looking at it from the perspective that taxes somehow came from the people to the banks. Now that's not really possible. It is the case though that like a huge amount of Ireland ended up in a foreign debt problem created by the banks. Now that is a problem even in MMT, because you don't have a problem with tax as long as it's in your own. You don't have a problem with debts as long as it's in the currency that you're creating. You do have a problem though. Let's say you borrow $100 million. Well, we can't make dollars.
It's not popped into my head. Isn't that what China is doing to parts of Africa?
Yeah, exactly. So there's the colonial issue. It's the same as we just said about the English coins. Same thing. If you owe $100 million though, then you've got a different problem, because you can't create dollars. So you've got to only way you can get dollars is, and you're back to what we just talked about. You have to earn them. So you have to trade with the Americans or with their bases or get American military base. You know what I mean? You have to buy their products or whatever, or sell them stuff. Essentially,
it's like a little money war game.
Yeah,
it's almost like checker and chess,
yeah,
where it's carefully planned to move, and if you make a mistake, you lose.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think it's important. You can see why it's extremely important. People understand it's very important, isn't it? Why you understand how it works, whose money you're using, why you're using it, who you're borrowing off, you know, all that kind of stuff. Because it does matter, and I think the countries that understand that the best. So, for example, like we talked about Germany, there's a reason why they run those not-for-profit community banks. I mean, there's a good reason, you know. And it's not because, you know,
I think like a safety net, a kind of like, we've been here before, we've seen this shit before, or we're not taking any chances.
They're running a system that they're not going to allow private profit speculation to take over their housing and other national services, because they understand that actually their economy is built on having them, you know.
This is why Germany wasn't all worked up about the football clubs, because they had shares in the clubs, the public, or the fans had.
Yeah.
Where in Ireland, England, company, privateers with billions and billions own the football clubs.
Yeah.
So they do have a social system in Germany.
Yeah. So yeah, when they have community banks across the whole country, it just allows them to distribute money much more evenly, and also at a lower into the lower level of the economy, and to build.
Would you like to invest in a camper van and I open a travel bank?
Yeah. I would actually, because we are missing. That's exactly what we're missing. It tells you exactly what we're missing. We're missing a banking sector that actually works for the people.
Yeah.
You know what I
These
mean?
are private casino billionaire business people. And the same business people that are in the banks have got relatives in the government and have got best friends in the private companies that are swamping up all these places.
Yeah, I mean, it's grand that that exists, but it should be a lot smaller, and it shouldn't be sucking in the whole resources of the entire country. It usually only deals with like very big end commercial buildings and stuff. But the fact that they're now buying houses off of ordinary people and tells you that it's got out of it's well out of in Ireland. It's well out of control. You know,
it has been for a while, my friend.
But then, as we've discussed, it's also understandable because it's not just that the government are all evil and all that. It's that
that's right, yeah.
Well, there's partly that, but it's that
they're pretty much on the road of being. It is an indoctrination.
But Ireland in general, even though we're having this country, and you know, we're talking about it being created from the empire and all that, but because we supposedly half took it over again, if you know what I mean, as you were aware. Ireland's got all the psychological issues that go with that, and it doesn't function. It functions kind of in a halfway house. It's neither quite the empire. It's neither quite the empire because it doesn't quite understand the system, and it's not quite like that. But it's also not. It's not fully dysfunctional completely. It's pretty bad.
There's several other issues that come in there as well, and like the psychological.
It's kind of grey area, you know.
The psychological trauma and the oppression. Now that they have their own little empire and the system, they're still not quite sure how to operate because they don't still understand the origins of it or what it was designed to do in the first place. So yeah, I think we see that in the west of Ireland, we see the rest of Ireland. But the important thing is, I think, is that we keep plugging along, keep doing our thing, get involved with the arts, and have a good laugh in a few years down the road when it's all over.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mr. Foley, thank you very much for your time, my friend.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you soon.
Interesting.
More to come. Talk to you soon, my friend.
Thanks.